All right, so now let's go ahead and make an enemy just to add a little bit of variation and uniqueness and a little bit more challenge, a little bit more danger to our game, right? If you are in a third-person template, you don't need to do this step. If you're in a first-person template, you will need to do this step. Pretty much, if your game, when you hit play, if you have the mannequin, like if you can see a full body mannequin character in the scene, you don't need to do this step. If you're in the first-person game, your mannequin is just the arms holding a gun. So you'll need to do this step in order to actually have a mesh and animations for the enemy character. Go ahead and click on Content. So you're back at the root content folder. And again, this is only if you're in a first-person template. Go ahead and click Add. Do Add Feature or Content Pack, and then click on Third Person and add that to the project. Again, you don't need to do this unless you're in a first-person template. Then you'll need to do Content Drawer, Add Feature or Content Pack, and then select Third Person and Add to Project. Okay, and what that's going to do is it's going to give you the mannequins folder. It does give you the Unreal 4 mannequin, it looks like, as well. But we'll just want to focus on the mannequins folder. And there's actually a couple of things we're going to have to do here. This is actually more complex than it used to be in Unreal 4. We're going to have to make our own animation blueprint, which is kind of crazy. But for now, let's go ahead and make an AI controller class that can actually make our enemy move around. So I'm going to go into My Blueprints, make a folder. I'm just going to call it Enemies, because maybe I'll have multiple enemies in the future. I don't know. And then in here, I'm going to go ahead and create a new blueprint class. And I'm going to search all classes here for AI controller. And I want the one that's just called AI controller. And I'm going to call it enemy AI. Okay, once you have that, go ahead and open it up. And I can just immediately go over to the event graph. I don't need to worry about anything on the viewport, okay? And I'm going to go ahead and delete my event tick. And I'm going to do something that's pretty powerful that Unreal allows me to do. I can actually make my own custom event, add custom event, and I can have this thing fire off whenever I want, which is pretty cool. I'm going to call it track player. And this is going to be a very simple enemy. It's just going to chase the player around, and if it catches up to the player, it's going to do damage. It's not really going to be much smarter than that, but we're going to keep it fairly simple, do it all in blueprints. There is a better way of doing enemy behaviors, but we'll just stick with a basic blueprint for now. So after that custom event that I've called track player, I'm going to go ahead and drag out, and I'm going to do AI move to. AI move to. Okay, and for the pawn here, I'm going to click and drag backwards and say get controlled pawn. What this means is, because this is a controller class, I'm going to be using it to control my enemy character. So it just needs to know, hey, what's the pawn that I'm moving? Well, you're moving the pawn that you're controlling, right? And where is it moving to? I could get a destination, or I could tell it to move to a target actor, and I can say get player character. File and save that. That should be good for that part. And then here for event begin play, this is where I need to actually fire off my custom event, because there's nothing that's telling this thing to actually run, but I can tell it to run whenever I want. So on event begin play, I'm going to go ahead and search for set timer. And I'm going to do set timer by event. I think that's going to be pretty easy because I have my event right here, so I can just connect these red squares. That's awesome. And then let's go ahead and do 1 second here for the time. We might have to adjust that a little bit, but I think 1 second is probably going to be just fine for now. And then let's make sure we check the box looping there. Okay, so it should look like that. So event begin play, we're going to set a timer by event. I'm telling it to run this event. And it's going to wait a second and then loop it, and then wait a second and do it again, and wait a second, do it again, do it again, do it again. And what it's doing is getting the controlled pawn and moving it towards the player character. So I'll compile and save that. Okay. Let's go ahead and minimize this window, come back to our content drawer, and I'm going to right click again and create a new blueprint class. This is going to be a character class, and I'm going to call this BP underscore enemy character. I think I spelled that all right. BP underscore enemy character. I'm going to double click that to open it up. And it's got a few things in here that it's inheriting. It's got this capsule, which is actually its collision. So if I wanted this thing to be able to fit through like a doorway or something, I'd have to make sure that doorway is large enough for the capsule to pass through. It's got this arrow component, which is just telling me what direction is forward. And then it's got this mesh component, which doesn't actually have anything in here. But we're going to go ahead and assign that right now. So click on mesh, and then in the details, look for mesh and then skeletal mesh. And that drop down that says none, I'm going to click that. We have a few options. I'm going to go ahead and just click on Manny. And it's going to be a little bit weird. It's going to, at least, well, for me right there, it dropped it in. But for you, it might say waiting for or preparing skeletal mesh or something. So it might just take a little bit for it to drop in. But just give it some time. If it's kind of loading, just give it some time and it'll drop in. And then I'm going to go ahead and just drag this down. I do have my movement snap turned back on, so it should be, I think I went with -90 there. Yeah, that seems to fit pretty well. Its head might be a little bit above. That should be okay, though. Okay, it is facing the wrong direction, so I'm going to go ahead and rotate it. Okay. And then let me go ahead and click on the self right here. The very top component in that list, the self. And in the details, I need to look for pawn and then AI controller class. And right now it's using a default class that we're not going to use, right? I created my own that I called enemy AI. So I'm going to go ahead and select that. And I'll compile and save that. Now, in my testing on doing this, I found that it was much easier to just create my own animation blueprint out of the animations that are already in Unreal. So this is going to be a very basic animation blueprint, but it should be a good little crash course on how to actually get these things to move properly and update their poses. So let's go ahead and just minimize this again. And I am using that Manny character. So in my content browser, I should be able to click characters and then go to mannequins and then find meshes. And here's skeletal mesh Manny. That's the one I'm using. I'm going to click on that. I'm actually going to right click it and I'm going to say create anim blueprint. And it's fine if it creates it here. I'm just going to call it like my enemy anim BP. That way I know it's for the enemy, right? And it's the one that I'm making. Go ahead and double click that. Open that up. And you'll see I have this, this thing that's going to output a new pose to it, but there's nothing feeding into it, right? So what I need to do is right click and do a new state machine. Let's see, add new state machine. And I could just connect that up and that would be fine for what we're doing, but it's also nice to do a slot, default slot, just in case you want to, you know, maybe on a future game or project, you want to have some animation montages playing properly. You can use this slot, default slot, to really help that out, which is awesome. So I'm just going to go ahead and add that. And then I think I'm going to go ahead and disable this post process, and then I'll hit compile. And you'll see now this is connected up, which is great. And by default, I think in this window, you'll have the preview editor here. you want to click on Asset Browser just so you can see all the animations that are compatible with this skeletal mesh, which is the one I'm using, Manny. So I got all these things. That's awesome. But really quick, before I jump into all this, let's go back to the character and click on the mesh. And let's see, let me just double check that I did actually compile and save my anim blueprint. Okay, then I can go back to my enemy, click on the mesh, and where it says anim class, I'm going to go ahead and find my enemy anim BP. There's nothing working on it quite yet, but it's just going to make this this next step easier if I set that up now and compile and save. Okay, so again, all I did was click on the mesh, and I set up my enemy anim BP. It does _C by default. Don't worry about that. Just make sure you set that to the anim BP that you just created. And then we're going to jump back to the anim blueprint. Okay. And here, I want to jump to the event graph. And I'm going to move my try get pawn owner, kind of an interesting name. I'm going to move that up here and kind of move this one down a little bit. And I'm going to right click and I'm going to look for begin event blueprint begin play. Okay, those aren't lining up, so it's making me a little bit uneasy, but that's okay. I'm going to go ahead and drag from there and cast to, let's see, what did I call it? Enemy character. Cast to enemy character. I'm going to connect the return value here to the object there. Okay. And this is kind of just a nice thing. It just makes it so I only have to cast to my enemy character once. And then I can use, I'm going to make a variable out of that cast so I can use it down here every time I'm updating the animation. That way I only have to cast to it once. Okay. So I'm going to go ahead and right click where it says as enemy character and say promote to variable. So there's that. And then let me go ahead and just call it enemy, kind of abbreviate that, character reference, enemy char ref, enemy character reference. Okay, I'm going to go ahead and click and drag that out and say get that reference. And I'm going to drag from there and search is valid. Is valid. And I want the one that has a question mark on it there. Is valid. And again, this is just kind of a weird thing that Unreal wants me to do. So just go ahead and follow along for now. Is valid. And if it is valid, it's going to keep updating and doing all this cool stuff. What I want to do is get its speed. If it's ever moving, I want it to have its run animation, right? So from this character reference now, I can click and drag again. And I'm going to say, I think it's get velocity. Get velocity. I had to scroll down a little bit. Get velocity. Okay, and right now it's a vector. It's got a yellow pin. I actually need it to be a float. I need it to be a green pin. So I'm going to create a float out of this by dragging out and saying, I think it's get length or velocity length. Let's see, what is it called? It should just be length, maybe. Vector length. Vector length. Okay, so I just typed in length and it's the one called vector length. And now that's actually giving me a speed value. So I'm doing a little bit of math here. Again, you can just follow along. Get velocity, vector length. I'm going to right click that green circle, promote it to a variable, and I'm going to name it speed. And then I'll hook this up. Just like that. Now, again, if I had this enemy doing some more stuff, I could always get a reference or, drag from my reference and get some more information and create a variable. But for now, it's just going to be chasing me. So I just need to see if it's moving or not moving, which means its speed is going to be, actually a fairly high number. I think it's by default like 500 or 600 centimeters per second, or it's either going to be a very low number because it's not moving, right? So that should be fine. I'll compile and save. I do have a warning, and that's just because on my anim graph, my state machine doesn't have anything hooked up, okay? Let's go ahead and make sure from the event graph here, we go over to our anim graph and then double click that state machine to go inside this state machine here. And after entry, I'm going to click and drag, and I'm going to do add state, not state alias, just add state. And I'm going to call this state idle. And then from idle, the enemy will be able to start running. So I'm going to add another state, and I'll call this run, if I can type properly. And then from run, I'm actually going to drag another arrow back and create another transition there. So what this means is I can go from, the enemy can go from idle to run, and then if it stops running, it can go back to idling, right? Because again, this is a fairly simple enemy. It's just going to be chasing me, or eventually not chasing me if I go outside of its navigable radius or whatever. So we'll get all that set up, but this is pretty much all I need here. But I still have to set this up. Each of these states needs an animation. So I'll double click the idle to go inside of that. And in my asset browser here, I have mm_idle. It says the retarget source was Manny. So that's the one I'm using is Manny. So I want to use the one that says the source is Manny. I'm going to go ahead and click and drag that out. And I'm going to connect it. And if I compile, you'll see it actually update here. So now it's actually idling. It's very cool. You can go back a level by just hitting that back arrow. There's my idle. For the run, I can double click that and I'll find the one that says run forward. Again, that retarget source should say Manny because I'm using Manny. So I'll click and drag that out, connect that up, and hit compile. It's not going to change here because the speed is currently 0. That's totally fine. And then I'll hit the back arrow again. And then these little transitions, these circles, if I double click these, I can give it information so it knows when to go from idle to run and then when to go from run to idle, okay? So we'll do this first one here, idle to run. Double click that. And what I need to do is see if that speed variable is actually above 0. And really what I need to do is see if it's above a very small number, right? Because I want to make sure it's definitely moving. If it's only just barely moving, like if its speed was 0.01 for some reason, then it would be doing the run animation, even though it would be virtually holding still on the screen, right? So I just need to make sure it's greater than or equal to a very small number. So I'm going to just type in 5 and then plug that in. And then I'll go back one level and I'll click on the other transition, double click that to open that one up. And I'm going to drag out speed, say get speed, and I'm going to check if this is less than or equal to another very small number. So I don't think it can really, there's maybe a chance it could go between 5 and 4. So you could just, type in 5 again. Well, actually, I used equal on the other one, so you couldn't do 5. But I'm going to go ahead and just type in 4 here. You can just follow along. It'll work. This works just fine. And then hook those up like that. And if I compile that, now I have a green check because all of my states have been satisfied and they have an animation and all of the transitions have something telling it how to transition. So that should be good. So compile and save. If you still have warnings, just go ahead and double check that your idle actually has the idle animation and make sure your run actually has the run animation. Then make sure your transitions have the speed set to check if it's greater than a small number, and then the other transition is less than a small number, okay? Just make sure all that's hooked up, and when you compile, it should give you a green check, and that's awesome. So now if I go back to my enemy character, you can see it's now doing the idle animation, which is awesome. If yours is not, just double check that mesh. The animation blueprint class here is the one that we just created. Just make sure that's actually set. And then really quick, the enemy is actually faster than my player character. So I'm going to go to character movement and search for max walk. And I think I'm going to make it, I'm just going to cut that number in half. I'll do 300. That'll be fine. Maybe that'll be a little bit slow. You could try like 350, but I'll go with 300. That should be okay. All right, and then let me just double check that I did set the pawn here on the self. I did, perfect. Okay, so let's go ahead and drag this enemy out into our scene, which is in my blueprint folder. Enemies, there we go. And when I drag it out, you'll notice that it's like clipping through the ground. That's okay. As soon as I let go of the mouse, it's going to snap up to its feet. That's great. And if I hit play, nothing. Okay, so there's one more thing I got to add, and it's called a nav mesh bounds volume. So if you still have your place actors tab here, we're going to use that. If not, go ahead and do window, place actors, and that will bring it back. And I'm going to click on all classes, and then I'm going to search in here nav mesh bounds volume. Nav mesh bounds volume. I'm going to click and drag that out, and it is clipping through the ground. That's fine. I actually want it to be clipping through the ground. And if you let go, it might fill in green for you. If it doesn't, go ahead and hit P on the keyboard. P is in piano, and it'll fill that in. And anywhere that's green is where the enemy will be able to move, as well as calculate where I am to chase me. So pretty much what I want for this enemy to chase me around this level, I want this nav mesh bounds volume to pretty much just take up the entire level, right? I'm going to go ahead and just scale it so the whole level is green, basically. And that should be good. So hopefully I'm not forgetting anything. I'll go ahead and test this out. The enemy's now chasing me. He's a little bit slow. Maybe I will step up the speed. But he's got that run animation, which is good. For some reason, we have to set up that blueprint ourselves so it actually has the run animation. Because by default, it wasn't picking up the speed. I was kind of testing it out, but now it's working. If he catches up to us, it stops. We're not taking damage yet, but that's how we can get a moving enemy. So very cool.